And we are back! Kept you wondering for a while, didn't I? Following on from the first part of this countdown, if you haven't seen it, watch that first. I will be finishing off my list of the top 20 Danganronpa executions. We've already gone through numbers 20 to 11 and only the top 10 remain. You know the deal by now, this is my personal list and of course, there will be major spoilers for the whole Danganronpa trilogy ahead, as well as the anime. Ye be seriously warned. So let's continue where we left off, starting with number 10, The Ultimate Punishment. Taking all of the executions from the first Danganronpa game and enduring them one after another with a massive smile on her face, Junko Enoshima, the real one this time, decides to execute herself via the punishment of all punishments. The 1000 blows, the Cage of Death, the burning of the Versailles Witch, Excavator Destroyer, Blast Off, and finally ending it all with After School Lesson, which results in Junko being crushed to death. Man, is it satisfying. The small pause before the giant block comes crashing down does wonders. Almost as if the last thing Junko was thinking was that the execution might have malfunctioned before we finally see her gamer girl juices suddenly splat everywhere. Who wrote this shit? The build-up was good too, as we see Junko happily waving her life away as all the familiar execution sets assemble themselves around her. And to credit Danganronpa 1, I kinda miss the way the execution sets would build in the background. It really helped set the scene. But as we all know, that's not the last we'll see of Junko. Number 9, Forced Shutdown. After her grand-sized return, literally, Junko is defeated a second time in Danganronpa 2, Goodbye Despair, by none other than Usami, wielding the power of gay. Yep, apparently this counts as an execution too, with Junko's alter ego self being on the receiving end of an actual 3D animated death sequence. Yep, here you can clearly see Usami's playing a bait and punish game by attacking alter ego Junko's swift hand swat attempts before kicking her in the face and tying her up in a rainbow trailed rope? Yep, that's Danganronpa. Until at least alter ego's Junko Body breaks apart into a million cubes and she is eliminated in quite the flashy sequence. Pfft, what do you mean why is it higher than the ultimate punishment? It was cool, okay? Am I the only one who liked this one? The power of gay, you guys, come on. But yeah, it's pretty random, especially with Usami coming out of nowhere, but I really like the look of this sequence. No, not like that. And I think it brought exactly the right energy to keep the hyped up pace of the finale going. Almost makes you forget that it all makes absolutely zero sense. Good old Danganronpa. Number 8. Deep Fried Teruteru. This execution ends with a pervert being dropped into a live volcano. That's right, we're getting onto the good ones now. From the final execution in Danganronpa to the very first one, Teruteru serves as the main course this time around. You can see immediately just how much these executions have gotten more over the top between the first and second games, as Teruteru is blasted with missiles from a helicopter piloted by Monokuma that contains eggs and breadcrumbs before of course being dumped into a volcano by said helicopter, where he proceeds to be fried to death. All of which is seen by the rest of the Danganronpa 2 cast via a monitor that Monokuma so generously set up. It's funny, but the highlight of this execution to me is the moments just before it happens. We are introduced to a new catchy execution track as the camera zooms past all the spotless characters and finally arrives at Teruteru, who is then dragged away by a chain, similar to Leon in his execution in Danganronpa 1. Overall, it was a good execution that successfully concluded a great trial, which all kicked off the rest of the game in a very positive manner for me. Say what you will about Teruteru, but he did not deserve that. Number 7, Blast Off, Second Ignition. A punishment perfect for the ultimate astronaut, Kaito Momota is killed via the second appearance of the Blast Off rocket. Or that was the plan anyway. The twist of this punishment sequel is that the Blackened doesn't actually die in the way that's intended. So let's go through it, almost mirroring the original Blast Off, this time with Monokuma in the appropriate cosplay. Wait a minute. Kaito is trapped inside a rocket which, instead of shooting straight up, plummets downwards and digs its way underground until it emerges through the other side of the planet and finally reaches for the stars. but instead of assumably crashing back down and killing Kaito, he instead chooses this opportunity to give in to his illness and cough up his final sip of pink Fanta. This all happens after he stubbornly exclaims that he's not going to die the way Monokuma wants, and Monokuma becomes furious at this end result. Kaito manages to die on his own terms, giving one last middle finger to Monokuma if you will, and succeeds in causing the first failed execution. The rocket carrying Kaito's body crashes down as expected, with Kibo blocking the rubble and losing his Hoge in the process. But of course the true nature of Kaito's death is revealed once those rocket doors open. Kaito Momota, luminary of the stars, was finally able to witness them. What a way to end it. Number 6, the burning of the Versailles witch. Just falling short of top 5 is the execution of everyone's favourite goth girl. Celestia Ludenberg may not have had the best motive in the world for a double murder, but she did have a pretty fitting execution. Putting on a brave face until the very end, Celestia is burned at the stake much like a so-called witch would be back in the medieval ages. There's a very slow build up as the crowd gathers and the fire is started before it eventually begins to engulf Celestia as she looks up towards the sky, almost satisfied with the style of execution chosen to put her at rest. Can't say I relate, that looks like a fucking nightmare to go through. Despite this, the music is very somber yet peaceful and gives off a different mood compared to the other executions of the first Danganronpa game. Lacking the usual quirkiness too, it almost seems like it's an execution chosen by Celestia rather than Monokuma. Until that is a big loud modern as fuck fire truck interrupts everything and literally crashes into the scene, crushing Celestia's body as well as her last desire to have a gothic styled execution, instead ironically making it so that she's killed in a very common fashion in the least special way possible, while bringing in that classic Monokuma styled randomness. That bear is a master troll. Number 5 is One Woman Army. After a very emotionally driven second trial and a long goodbye between Peko and Fuyuhiko, we jump straight into the execution of Peko Yama. Man, that's hard to say. Peko is controlled by Monokuma as she is forced to charge into a crowd of wooden samurai robots, slicing them one after another while Fuyuhiko desperately attempts to reach her. When he finally manages to do so, however, one of the robots jumps up in front of him and causes Peko to accidentally strike Fuyuhiko. Horrified, Peko drops everything in an instant and goes to cradle Fuyuhiko in her arms before being repeatedly stabbed by the robot samurai, body blocking Fuyuhiko from further harm. There's quite a bit that goes unanswered in this execution, and I think in a way it makes it all the more interesting. For example, there's quite a bit of discourse on whether Peko believes she may have killed Fuyuhiko here, making it quite an ironic end for someone who's supposed to have protected him, and making the execution that much more tragic, turning a scene that looks like she's shielding Fuyuhiko into one where she's simply mourning what she's done to him. Imagining Peko dying with her last thought being that she killed the most important person to her is definitely a despair-inducing execution. After all, the rest of the class also believes that both of them had died until Monomi eventually points out that Fuyuhiko is still alive. Either way, whatever you choose to believe, it's not hard to see why this one is so high up on the list. It's still funny to me that the execution that follows this is Mikan being launched into space on a giant arm. Not all executions are made equal. Number 4, the 1000 blows. With the reveal of our very first Blackened comes the very first class trial execution. Leon Kawata, the ultimate baseball star, is killed for his murder of Sayaka Miyazono via a fuck ton of baseballs. More specifically, Leon is shackled around the neck and pulled away by a chain, where he is then strapped to a post in a baseball batting cage, completely helpless. The rest of the students stand and watch as Leon is pelted by numerous baseballs fired by a pitching machine, as well as Monokuma himself, who launches quite a few with a baseball bat. It's a very run-of-the-mill execution for Danganronpa standards, which isn't surprising considering it's the first proper one, but it's still very well done nonetheless, and is a nice introduction to what we can expect for the remainder of the game's trials. It helps further cement this bone-chilling situation these teenagers are all in, as well as the punishments for fucking up your murder plans with some hauntingly fantastic shots served with creepy music and horrified reactions from the rest of the cast. This is how you make an impact in an execution. A fitting execution, sure, but one that's made even more so when you remember that Leon hated baseball and wanted to escape from it. Makes him forcibly getting strapped to a baseball post all the more symbolic. So here we are, the final three, what I like to think of as the top tiers as you will, because there's definitely a large gap for me between these three and the rest of the series executions. And honestly, they're so close together in terms of how much I like them that they're by far the hardest to order. With that being said, let's get on with it. Number 3, please insert coin. Taking the bronze medal is Best Girl Chucky's execution, with a sequence that would obviously tickle at my gamer bone. That sounds extremely wrong. Chucky's Death is a chaotic 3-part journey through the retro arcade games Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and finally Tetris, where she and Monami are finally crushed to death. So, just to get it out of the way, first of all, how dare you? Might be strange that I'm putting this execution so high considering I've blatantly stated Chucky as best girl, but that's the bittersweet thing about Danganronpa. I hate and love this series so much. This execution kicks things off with a sick retro remix of the usual DR2 execution theme, which we first hear in Deep Fried Teruteru, that probably builds up what's about to happen better than any execution thus far. Makes sense after all, we're losing a pretty major well-loved character here, and the game is wasting no time milking the fuck out of our bleeding hearts. But why stop there? During the Space Invaders segment, the game even teases us by presenting Chucky an exit door after shooting a bunch of Monomies with a tank, and thus we are led to the Pac-Man segment in which more Monomies are lost. And then finally, it's Tetris time. This part of the execution is foreshadowed when you speak to Chucky earlier on in the chapter, who tells you that she was having a bad dream about a Monokuma tile game. And despite this being another execution where someone is crushed to death, all the suspense around it makes it feel like so much more. The look Chucky gives, as well as the long pause before the final Tetris block falls, makes it all the more impactful when, after all that, it doesn't even matter. Apart from the minor goofy moments here and there, this was a damn solid execution that was both cruel and creative. Damn, I can't help but reluctantly be impressed. Number 2, the Flouncer. I'm almost positive that's not how you pronounce it. I will just be referring to it as the Flea Waltz from now on. Anyway, just missing out on the number 1 spot is the very first execution of Danganronpa V3, and as you can see, they've set these things up to a much more grand scale. Death by a giant piano was the obvious choice for punishing Kaede Akamatsu, the ultimate pianist, but I never expected it to be used in such a horrifying way. Essentially balancing on piano keys with a noose round her neck, Kaede is controlled by the monocubs as she hits off-note keys on the piano with her body and plays a very bad rendition of Flea Waltz while struggling to gasp for air between key transitions. Monokuma acts as the conductor, and a bunch of Monokuma are also in the crowd, booing and throwing rocks at Kaede as if she wasn't already going through literal torture. Until in the end we see Kaede's lifeless body swinging from the rope, having died from asphyxiation. Finally, the spiked piano cover crashes down, crushing Kaede's body along with Monokid, whose head rolls all the way over to the rest of the students, revealing that they had been watching the entire thing. This, along with Kaede being dragged by a shackle round the neck after avoiding stares from her peers, directly references both DR1 and DR2's first executions, and much like those two games' first punishments, this must have been extremely hard to watch for these students, especially Shuichi. It's a fucking brutal execution, and as pointed out by the Danganronpa community, Kaede played the whole song on white keys despite the majority of the song usually being played on black keys, foreshadowing that Kaede was never the blackened, which is something we find out in the final chapter. Also, just to note that the creepy music played at the end is similar to what we hear in Leon's execution. Some believe they can even hear the word innocent be spoken here. fucking yikes, let's move on. Number 1, Strand of Agony. And making it all the way to the top is DV3's very own execution of Kirumi Tojo. Much like Celestia's, the punishment used here doesn't reflect Kirumi's ultimate talent very much, though it does fit her character and how far she's willing to go to escape from the killing game and return to her people. And the execution starts off with just that, Kirumi running from Monokuma until she is ambushed by a group of protesters and is left with nowhere to go, until that is a thorny vine drops down in front of her, acting as her only means of escape. And that's when it begins. Using Kirumi's desperation, Monokuma is able to spin a web of false hope, similar to Chiaki's execution in the Danganronpa anime, which is why she is able to put herself through such pain, which is interesting because it's self-inflicted. Unlike the other executions, Kirumi isn't actually being forced to do any of this. This is amplified further by this being the only execution where Monokuma doesn't even appear. Instead, Kirumi's pride and selfless devotion as a maid is being used against her. In fact, it's being continuously tested by introducing more and more obstacles for Kirumi to bypass until she is left in a helpless state. Unlike what she is used to, Kirumi is powerless to do anything other than desperately continue her endeavour, no matter how much she struggles. And again, like Chucky's execution in the anime, in the end this all proves to be pointless. Like a hamster on a wheel, Kirumi's painful journey doesn't get her anywhere, and you can see her last hope fade from her eyes as she has indeed, by nobody's surprise of her own, been bamboozled. All that shrieking, all that pain, and in the end, all it did was leave a hopeless corpse, as the very illusion Kirumi was tricked by flutters on top of her lifeless body and soaks up her blood. Man, oh man, it doesn't get any more brutal than this. It's definitely another one that's incredibly hard to watch, as you see Kirumi's once dignified level-headed manner start to unravel until she is left in such a sorry state. I can't help but be impressed and at the same time deeply concerned about Kirumi's determination. Makes it 10 times worse when you realise it was all because of a fabricated backstory. God damn. Anyway, that's it for me. Let me know if you want me to make any more Danganronpa content. I'd love to be able to rank the class trials in a similar fashion, so if you want to see that, leave a like and a comment, and be sure to check out my other content as well. Until next time.